Now, the government in Chad has pardoned 380 rebels who were handed life sentences in connection with the murder of former President Idriss Deby. Now, they were part of a group of over 400 people who were sentenced last week. The former statesman was shot and killed in a battle against the rebels in 2021. His son, Muhammad, was named interim president by a transitional council. For more on the story, let's bring in Dr. Chidochashe Nyere, who's with the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation at UJ, joining us via our telephone line this morning. Dr. Nyere, it's great to have you on the program. Thanks so much indeed for making time to speak to us. Quite an interesting story, this. So the president gets killed, his son takes over as interim president, and then goes on to pardon 380 of those who've been arrested in connection with that killing. He says in an official statement that it's part of Ramadan celebrations, but is there more to it, do you think?
Good morning, Ayanda. Yes, there is definitely more to it. So what we are seeing in Chad is a protracted political quagmire. And this political quagmire has many manifestations. And at this stage, it's manifesting as if it's an issue of a rule of law. But this is not the case. In the first instance, one could want to ask what would be the president doing in the battlefront? And this suggests that there is more to it. In fact, I think that the president was sacrificed. And this is part of a Western agenda, particularly from France. But to speak more to the issue that you are really speaking about, in terms of the sentence that was passed to the more than 400 prisoners who are then pardoned 4 or 5 days later, this tells us that this is actually a political prosecution, or it's political persecution by other means. And they are trying to now use the rule of law, and I say that very carefully, because the rule of law in this case, I'm just saying they are trying to bring law and the institutions of courts to come into the fold. But this is not the case. This case is a classical manifestation of rule by law. Right? So the rule by law works in this way. They are using courts, they are appealing to law to say there is a procedure that has found these people guilty. And remember, this was a mass sentence. And you could even throw in the fact that procedurally the court was held in a prison. So already you can see that they are trying to appeal to law, but it's failing because there was no case to answer in the first place. So the pardoning is just a masquerade to try and force these so-called rebels to come to the negotiating table. And I say so-called rebels because they may have committed acts of terrorism, particularly recruiting child soldiers, right? That could be a case, but this is not the case that they were prosecuted for. Right. And they are now so-called rebels because the government itself, the so-called establishment in Chad, is illegitimate. So while they see the rebels, which really are opposition political factions, they see them as rebels, yet they are not legitimate. They don't really have the authority to be running that country. Remember, when President Idriss was killed, and you correctly said his son took over, right? The agreement was that that interim government would run until October 2022, so last year. But it has also has been extended to October 2024. So you really see that while they try to appeal to rule of law, it is really...
Oh dear, what a pity. It looks like we've lost our connection to Dr. Nyere, and there's just so much to unpack from his first response there. Doc, hopefully you can still hear us. And because you've said so much, I'm hoping we could take it in bite sizes. You first started off by mentioning that Dr. Idriss may have been sent to the front lines as some kind of sacrifice. To what end?
To taking him out in terms of his political career. Now, I say this because, remember, Dr. Idriss is an ally, was an ally, by the way, of the Western world, particularly France. And we know that France never operates alone. France always is in cahoots with two others, particularly the UK and the US. So they always operate as a collective. So wherever the US or the UK and France manifest, they are working together. Now, there was that plan to take out the clause in the Electoral Act of Chad to allow the president 2 terms, right, of 6 years each. Now, if you look at that move, in 2005, the constitution was actually designed in that way, right? So Chad in 2005, we had that clause to say a president will have 2 terms, and after those 2 terms, you are subjected to an election. And remember, when King, I'm tempted to say King, President Idriss was assassinated, and I say assassinated, contrary to the going narrative that he suffered wounds from the battlefront. He was assassinated. He had won the election. So it meant that he still had 12 more years, right? They still had 12 more years with him. And he was changing a lot of legislation, particularly issues of mining, right? So Chad is very rich in mineral resources, and this is common knowledge. It's rich in gold, diamonds, granite, uranium, you name them. And particularly uranium. Uranium is used in the production of nuclear weapons. So part of it has to do with nuclear proliferation. He had expressed ambitions, right, to develop these. And we know with the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Act, it prohibits that, particularly from countries in the global south, Africa specifically.
Right.
So this is where I argue that he was sacrificed. And it's not really the rebels. These rebels are a front to give justification why he died.
In other words,
he was sacrificed.
Yeah, they're being scapegoated in one way or the other. At least that's what you believe. If this is an assassination indeed, do you reckon Muhammad the son was in on it?
Whether or not he was in on it, it's immaterial. Because he has always had ambition himself. He has always had ambition himself. And part of why they wanted to reintroduce the presidential terms was to curb that, because the suspicion and the fear in Chad was that President Idriss wanted this to be a dynasty. So if it is true that he wanted it to be a dynasty, it was quite clear that the next in line would be one of his sons. And clearly, Mahatma was well placed in terms of the military and also in terms of the state structure. Illegitimate as it is, but he was well placed. So whether or not he was in on it, it's immaterial.
More than 400 people were arrested, but only about 380 were pardoned. Part of those who we understand wasn't pardoned is the exiled head of the country's main rebel group, FACT. I think that's how you pronounce it. What do you read into that?
Yes. So what I read into it, remember, this is a military junta. In other words, they are military hardcore. They are military to their very fabric. Now, with military operations, they always operate in zero-sum games. In other words, they have to control. So what I read into this, it is an ambition to control the narrative so that anyone who sees that gesture, they think it is goodwill, they think it is for the good of the Chadians in terms of charting a way forward given the political quagmire they have. However, the very fact that the FACT leader is still incarcerated, it tells you that it's not sincere. So that gesture is insincere in itself, because then they will always want to say, we have your leader here, and until your leader gives in to our demands, will we let him off and let him go. So you can tell it's insincere. The negotiation table is not leveled, and therefore they have the upper hand. They can still do what they please with him, because if you ask all these 300 and something that have been pardoned, why has the leader himself not been pardoned? So already it raises questions, and unfortunately, military juntas and militaries operate in that way.
Sure. So it's some kind of leverage, if you like, for the government to continue having an upper hand. I mean, as you mentioned, a vote was meant to take place on October 2022. That's been delayed by 2 years. In fact, it led to some kind of protest in that country, understandably. How confident are you that the vote will ever take place?
I am not confident at all. And we will see as this story is developing, the fact that they just pardoned these 300 and something people on Saturday, maybe if it is indeed a gesture of goodwill, maybe we will see them pardoning the leader as well. But if that doesn't happen, I don't see elections ever taking place. And remember, I'm not just saying this in the context that we are sitting with today, but we have to look back into how Chadians have always succeeded power in terms of the leader. There are always squabbles. Unfortunately, one leader comes in via a coup, another one comes in via succession. So you realize that they are not really sincere, particularly as the junta is still in power. Unless that junta transitions to a civilian government, a civilian interim government, I don't see them having elections at all.
Fascinating stuff. Thanks for helping us connect the dots, at least from your vantage point. Really do appreciate your take on this. Dr. Chidochashe Nyere, who's with the Institute of Pan-African Thought and Conversation at UJ. Once again, Doc, thanks very much indeed for your time.